we are again at World Crisis Radio. Remember, Tarpley.net, lots of new things up this week, several interviews. We will soon have this article about how to deal with the default or so-called bankruptcy of the United States. And again, our strategic premise is either the zombie banks will shut down the U.S. government or the U.S. government will shut down the zombie banks. Choose. I choose the latter. I want the U.S. government to shut down the zombie banks. We're reporting also on the austerity psychosis. We now have this new monstrosity, the Obama Budget Commission, chaired by Biden. Now remember, this is not the Gang of Six, alias the Crapo Commission. The Crapo Commission, of course, being that bipartisan group of senators. It's interesting, the House Republicans, in their reactionary fury, give you the Ryan Plan, which is a pure Republican reactionary document. Or if that's not enough, then you have the Republican Study Group, which is the straight Tea Party line, even worse. But the Democrats of the Senate have not got the guts to come up with a Democratic budget. Even Van Hollen in the House comes up with a House Democratic budget with some things of merit, right? Cutting corporate welfare for oil companies, which is a fine thing. But in the Senate Democrats refuse to come up with their own budget. Instead, they hide behind Saxby Chambliss, the scoundrel, Coburn, the budget gouger, and, of course, Senator Crapo of the Dakotas, I think. So the Republicans get their say. The Democrats don't get theirs. Now, inside this budget commission, we're finding the proclivity of the Democrats to sell out, to betray, to reveal their Wall Street obedience. We have Claire McCaskill, I think, of Missouri, who is facing a hard reelection. So she's anxious to sell out. Claire McCaskill joins with Corker of Tennessee. It's for a proposal to cap federal spending at 20% of the gross domestic product. All of these straitjackets, all reminiscent of Graham, Rudman, Hollings, all useless and extremely damaging. If they're taken seriously, they're a national suicide. If not, they become simply another cynical document. The Republicans demand a balanced budget constitutional amendment. This shows the hatred of the Republicans and the Tea Party against the Constitution. It's one of the main advantages of the U.S. Constitution compared to the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution says Congress shall have the power to borrow money on the credit of the United States. The Tea Party says, no, we hate the Constitution. We want to change that. We want to take away the power of the Congress to borrow money on the credit of the United States. Now, would such an amendment be ratifiable? In other words, they say they want that constitutional amendment as a precondition for a budget deal. But, of course, it has to go to the states. You got to get 3/4 of the states to support that. Could you? We've gone through the statistics from the recent polling. This is a New Deal nation. We have 2/3 to 3/4 to 4/5 support for Medicare, Medicaid, and other elements of the New Deal social safety net. We have 4/5 support for a surtax on millionaires, but the support for cutting Medicare, Medicaid, and the other things that would be sacrificed by this balanced budget idiocy is down in the teens or the 20% range at most, the lunatic fringe of anti-government right-wing anarchist reactionaries. So that's a very limited group. So I don't see how this could ever be ratified, and I think people would work very hard to prevent it. Concerning the debt ceiling, the most recent estimate now from the Washington Post is that the Treasury would begin to default on payments, on bond interest, I guess, around July 8th. So July 8th now becomes the target. Originally they were reporting May. Now it's slipped into July. We've seen this pattern of top finance oligarchs attempting to dump the dollar. And again, we need to be ready with a plan. If the finance oligarchs, and especially this fanatical Koch brothers, Mellon Scaife, Tea Party combination, if these ideologues, really with an insane ideology, if they go all the way and force the national bankruptcy of the United States, what do we do? Well, remember, if the Treasury bonds become insolvent, the reserves of every central bank in the world, which are largely held in the form of U.S. Treasury bonds, will also be devalued. So many central banks will go into there will be panic runs on those central banks. There will be panic runs on the Federal Reserve. And the way that works is, it happened in the 1930s. You had member banks, for example, the different banks that are members of the Federal Reserve would say, we've given you, Federal Reserve, we've given you money to become a member. We need that money back now to avoid bankruptcy. So as the banks drop out of the Federal Reserve, you'd have a panic run on the Federal Reserve by its component member banks. If this happens, this is another reason to seize the Federal Reserve. Let's assume that this panic run does materialize. What do you do then? At that point, the Treasury has to seize the Federal Reserve, nationalize it. We say from then on, once the crisis is over, I guess you'd have to deal with the crisis by decree for a while, but the norm would be a bill coming from the House, passed by the Senate, signed by the President, specifies the amount of credit, $2 trillion, $3 trillion per year, whatever it is, the interest rates, and the approved categories of lending. And you know what those should be. Real production, agriculture, industry, construction, scientific research, not financial speculation, the reverse of what Bernanke is now doing. With several $trillion of 0% federal credit, you can then reliquefy the regional banking systems. The zombie banks in Wall Street would pretty much have to be shut down because they are in a kind of connubium with the Federal Reserve. In other words, the existence of Citibank, Bank of America, and J.P. Morgan Chase is predicated on the idea that they're getting these secret, under-the-table loans. Right? We find out about that in retrospect. Right? Part of the $3.3 trillion that was revealed a little while ago. But now under QE2 and QE3, if that comes, you're getting secret loans from one day to the next to keep these zombie institutions going. Well, if the Federal Reserve has a panic run, then those banks will become impossible to maintain. So we don't need them. What we need is a regional banking system, and that can be supported by the nationalized Fed. Let's start calling it the fourth bank of the United States, after the Hamilton one, after the Calhoun Clay one, and after the Daniel Webster one that unfortunately didn't get going because of the assassination of Tippecanoe William Henry Harrison. We had Tyler come in, and of course Tyler, as a proto-Confederate, sabotaged Daniel Webster's plan for a third bank of the United States. So let's call this one the fourth one, the third one having died stillborn. Seize the Fed, 0% federal credit for production only, not for banks. Close the zombie banks, crack down on the hedge funds, and begin using your regional banking system to provide credit for production. If they insist on destroying the existing system, well, we're not ready for it. But so let's get ready for it. Let's do everything we can to avoid the bankruptcy of the system, because this would lead to chaos and death on a large scale around the world. Because as I stress, every central bank and really every private bank at that point becomes insolvent. And we can't then start going to the market and trying to borrow money. Imagine the irony. You've got these zombie banks that are creatures of the U.S. government in particular, right? The Federal Reserve functioning as the worldwide central bank. Why do we need to go to zombie banks and borrow money when the zombie banks are only there because the federal government has propped them up in the first place? Eliminate the zombie banks. Make the Fed our bank, the Bank of the United States. Plenty of 0% federal credit. We don't need Goldman Sachs. We don't need Barclays. We don't need J.P. Morgan. And you get the idea. So I'll be ready with that program. Back in a minute.